There is a moment, somewhere in your day, when music finds you without warning. Maybe it comes through a window, a melody drifting from a neighboring apartment, soft and half-heard, already gone before you can name it. Maybe it rises from inside a passing car, or hums beneath the noise of a crowded street, or arrives quietly through a pair of headphones pressed against tired ears at the end of a long day. You don't think about it. You simply receive it, the way you receive warmth from sunlight or the smell of rain before it falls. Music is so woven into the fabric of human life that most people never stop to ask where it came from. It seems like it was simply always there, as natural and inevitable as breathing, as old as the first human thought. And in a sense, that feeling is not wrong. Music may be older than almost everything else we consider distinctly human. Older than written language. Older than agriculture. Older, some researchers believe, than the spoken word itself. But there was a moment, somewhere deep in the unrecorded past, when it did not exist. When the world was full of sound, but no human hand had yet shaped that sound into something intentional. No rhythm kept. No note sustained. No voice lifted in a pattern designed to move another person's chest. And then something changed. Someone, we will never know their name, never know the color of the sky above them or the name of the river nearby, did something deliberate with sound. Struck something. Blew through something. Held a note and let it carry. And the world became, in that instant, a different kind of place. What followed is one of the strangest and most quietly astonishing stories in all of human history. Music spread across every culture that ever existed on this earth. It appeared in deserts and rainforests, in frozen tundra and river deltas, in societies that had never contacted one another and had no shared language, no shared religion, no shared understanding of the world. And yet they all made music. The object, known as the Didgeridoo flute, has 4 holes arranged along its surface in a pattern that some researchers argue is intentional and musical. If they are right, it was made not by modern humans but by Neanderthals, a different species of human entirely, one long assumed to have lacked the cognitive complexity for symbolic or artistic behavior. The debate around this object has never fully been resolved. Some scientists believe the holes were made by the teeth of a carnivore gnawing on the bone. Others, after careful analysis of the hole angles and spacing, maintain that the object is genuine, the earliest known musical instrument on Earth, made by a species that disappeared roughly 40,000 years ago. What that would mean is almost too large to hold in the mind at once. It would mean that music did not begin with us. It would mean that the impulse to arrange sound into meaning, to take the raw noise of the world and shape it into something intentional, predates our own species. That somewhere in the deep past, before modern humans arrived in Europe, a Neanderthal sat in firelight, held a piece of bone, and made something that was, in some sense, music. Long before any instrument was carved or constructed, the first musical instrument was the human body itself. Clapping, stomping, slapping the chest and thighs, percussive body music almost certainly predates any external object used to make sound. Researchers studying the origins of music believe that rhythm came before melody, and that rhythm began not as entertainment but as coordination. Groups of early humans who could synchronize their movements, who could clap together, march together, work together in time, had a measurable advantage in collective tasks. This is sometimes called the shared intentionality hypothesis, the idea that rhythm evolved not for pleasure but for cooperation. When a group of people synchronize to a beat, something measurable happens in the brain. Trust increases. Pain thresholds rise. The sense of individual boundary softens, and something closer to group identity takes its place. The oldest drum, a physical object designed to be struck rhythmically, dates to around 5,500 years ago in Mesopotamia. But the body drum is far older. Anthropologists believe it may be as old as the species. Which means the first concert in human history required no instruments, no stage, and no preparation. Only hands, and the decision to move them together. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the cities of Sumer and Akkad, in the river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, music was not considered a human invention at all. It was believed to have been handed down directly from the gods. The Sumerians had a goddess named Inanna who was specifically associated with music and the instruments used to make it. Temple musicians held positions of enormous social and religious importance. The lyre, a stringed instrument that appeared in Mesopotamia as early as 3000 BCE, was considered sacred, and playing it was understood as a form of prayer. Certain notes were associated with specific deities. Certain scales were believed to have healing properties. What this reveals is something important about how early civilizations understood the function of music. It was not entertainment. It was not art in the modern sense. It was a technology for communicating with forces beyond the visible world. Sound, in this framework, was a medium like smoke from a fire, like the movement of water, through which the human and the divine could make contact. The musician, then, was not a performer. They were something closer to a priest. And the instrument they held was not unlike an altar. The oldest known written song in human history was found on a clay tablet in the ancient city of Ugarit, in what is now Syria. It dates to approximately 1400 BCE and is written in cuneiform notation, a system of symbols pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. The song is a hymn to the moon god Nikkel, and it includes not just the words but what researchers believe are actual musical instructions, indications of the tuning, the intervals, and the rhythm with which it was meant to be performed. When musicologists reconstructed and performed this song in the 20th century, they found that it used harmonics, the layering of notes, to create richer, fuller sound far earlier than had previously been believed. For a long time, Western music history treated harmony as a medieval European invention. This clay tablet, pressed by anonymous hands in a Syrian city that no longer exists, quietly rewrote that story. The song itself is a love song of sorts, a devotional poem addressed to a goddess, describing her beauty and the warmth of her light. Whoever composed it, whatever their name, whatever their life, they wanted to give something beautiful to the sky. And they wrote it down, so it would last. It lasted 3,400 years. Ancient Egypt had a vast and sophisticated musical culture, and yet for a long time, historians knew almost nothing about what Egyptian music actually sounded like. This is because Egyptian musical notation, unlike the Mesopotamian system, did not record pitch. Egyptian hieroglyphs and tomb paintings showed musicians playing, showed instruments in detail, showed the gestures of singers, but did not preserve the actual notes. The music existed, thriving and elaborate, and then it fell silent, leaving only the image of itself behind. What archaeologists did recover were the instruments. Harps of extraordinary beauty, some standing taller than a human being. Flutes made from reed. Drums. Lutes. Clappers made from ivory and bone, shaped like human hands so that when you struck them together, it was as if the hands of the dead were keeping time. Egyptian musicians performed at funerals, at harvests, at religious festivals, at royal banquets. Some musicians, particularly those who played in temple contexts, were blind because blindness was associated in Egyptian theology with inner vision, with the ability to perceive what the sighted could not. To be a blind musician in ancient Egypt was not a misfortune. It was, in certain circles, considered a mark of sacred proximity. In ancient China, music was understood to be not merely an art form but a direct expression of cosmic order. The philosopher Confucius, writing in the 5th century BCE, believed that the moral condition of a society could be read directly from the music it produced. Harmonious music meant a harmonious state. Chaotic or excessive music was a warning sign, an early symptom of political and moral decay. He was not speaking metaphorically. He genuinely believed that sound had the power to order or disorder the human soul, and by extension, the civilization built from human souls. The Chinese imperial court maintained an office, the Bureau of Music, whose responsibility was to collect and preserve regional folk songs from across the empire. This was not done out of cultural curiosity. It was done because court officials believed that the songs ordinary people sang in the fields and villages were a kind of diagnostic tool. Happy songs meant a contented population. Mournful or restless songs were a signal that something in the province required the emperor's attention. Music, in this framework, was a form of intelligence gathering. The melody of a farming village, carried to the capital by a government collector, could influence imperial policy. The ancient Greeks believed that certain musical scales, they called them modes, had specific and measurable effects on human character. The Dorian mode was considered noble and steadying, appropriate for soldiers and citizens who needed courage without recklessness. The Phrygian mode was ecstatic and inflaming, associated with religious frenzy and states of altered consciousness. The Lydian mode was soft and mournful, considered dangerous because it encouraged self-pity and weakness of will. Plato, in his writings on the ideal state, argued that certain modes should be banned entirely. Not censored, not discouraged, banned. He believed that a young person raised on the wrong kind of music would develop the wrong kind of character, as inevitably as a plant grown in poor soil develops twisted roots. Music was not decoration. It was education of the deepest kind, and education that bypassed the rational mind and went directly to the soul. What is remarkable about this belief is that modern neuroscience has found evidence that it is not entirely wrong. Different musical modes and tempos do measurably affect heart rate, cortisol levels, and emotional state. Plato did not have brain scans or hormone measurements. But he was pointing at something real, something that music does to the body before the mind has time to decide how to respond. The word music itself comes from the ancient Greek word musik, meaning, literally, the art of the muses. The muses were the 9 daughters of Zeus and the goddess of memory, Mnemosyne. Each presided over a different form of creative expression. Calliope governed epic poetry. Terpsichore governed dance. Euterpe governed lyric song and the flute. But in the broadest Greek usage, musik referred to something larger than what we now call music. It encompassed all the arts governed by the muses together: poetry, song, dance, and the kind of intellectual and aesthetic refinement that distinguished the educated person from the merely clever one. To say someone was trained in musik was to say they had been shaped by civilization itself, that their inner life had been organized and elevated by sustained contact with beauty. The transition from this broad meaning to the narrower modern sense happened gradually, over centuries, as the different arts slowly developed their own vocabularies and institutional homes. But something of the original meaning still echoes in the word. When we call something musical a voice, a sentence, a movement, we are still reaching for that older idea. Not just sound. Something that has been shaped by something beyond itself. For most of ancient and medieval history, music existed only in the moment of its performance. There was no way to record it, to preserve it, to send it from one place to another intact. A song learned in one village traveled to the next village only if a person carried it there, in memory, and sang it again. Music that was not performed was music that ceased to exist. Every performance was, in a quiet sense, a resurrection. The only way the thing could continue to live was to be played again. This changed in the 9th century CE, when a Benedictine monk named Hucbald of St. Amand began developing one of the earliest systematic approaches to musical notation in Western Europe. He wanted to solve a practical problem. The Catholic Church had accumulated an enormous body of sacred chant, hundreds of melodies used in liturgical services, and there was no reliable way to ensure that a monastery in France sang the same melody as a monastery in Spain. Memory is imperfect. Teachers grow old and die. Songs drift, change, accumulate variations like a rumor passed from mouth to mouth across a continent. Hucbald's solution was to write them down, not just the words, but the shape of the melody. It was an act of preservation. It was also, without his intending it, the beginning of an entirely new relationship between music and time. The musical staff, the 5 horizontal lines on which modern musical notes are written, was invented by a single person, in a single lifetime, in 11th century Italy. His name was Guido of Arezzo, and he was a Benedictine monk with an extraordinary ear and an equally extraordinary frustration with how long it took to teach singers their parts. Before Guido, musical notation used a system of symbols called neumes, marks written above the text of a song that indicated the general shape of the melody, whether the voice should rise or fall, whether a note should be held or moved through quickly. But neumes did not indicate exact pitch. A singer reading neumes still had to have heard the melody before. They were memory aids, not complete instructions. Guido changed this by introducing a grid. Lines and spaces, each representing a specific pitch, so that a note placed on a particular line meant a particular sound, the same sound, every time, for every singer, whether they had heard the melody before or not. For the first time in Western history, a person could learn a song they had never heard simply by reading it. Guido himself reportedly said that a singer trained with his system could learn in a few days what had previously taken years. He did not know he was building the foundation on which every piece of Western music, from Palestrina to Bach to Beethoven to everything written today, would eventually be built. The musical scale that most Western listeners consider natural and inevitable, the one built into every piano, every guitar, every digital synthesizer, is not natural at all. It is a compromise. The system used in most Western music today is called equal temperament, and it was standardized in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries. In this system, the octave is divided into 12 equal steps. The mathematics are clean. Every key sounds the same relative to every other key, which means a piece of music can be transposed from one key to another without changing its character. But in order to achieve this mathematical equality, every single interval in the scale, except the octave itself, is slightly out of tune. Not enough that most listeners notice, but enough that a musician trained on older tuning systems could hear it immediately. Before equal temperament, Western music was tuned in systems where certain intervals were acoustically pure and resonant, where the mathematics of sound waves aligned in ways that produced an almost physical sensation of rightness. The trade-off was that these pure intervals existed only in certain keys. Other keys sounded subtly wrong, even painful. Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, a collection of preludes and fugues in all 24 major and minor keys, was partly written to demonstrate that the newer compromised tuning worked in every key. It was, among other things, a musical argument. The most beautiful argument in the history of the form. Gregorian chant, the ancient monophonic vocal music of the Catholic Church, is named after Pope Gregory I, who died in 604 CE. He almost certainly did not compose it. The legend that Gregory personally organized and codified the liturgical chant of the Catholic Church was cultivated in the centuries after his death, and it served important institutional purposes. Associating the music with a revered and canonized pope gave it authority that no collection of anonymous medieval monks could provide on their own. Later illuminated manuscripts showed Gregory receiving the melodies directly from the Holy Spirit, in the form of a dove perched on his shoulder and whispering into his ear. The actual music appears to have developed gradually, over centuries, through the contributions of hundreds of anonymous singers and composers across the monasteries and churches of Western Europe. It was a tradition, not a composition, something that grew like a living thing, shaped by many hands, in many places, over a very long time. What Gregory I may have actually done was administrative, organizing the calendar of which chants should be sung on which days. This was itself an enormous undertaking. But the legend of the dove on his shoulder, of divine music flowing directly into one man's ear, was a story invented after the fact, in service of an institution that needed its music to be sacred rather than merely old. Polyphony, the practice of singing or playing multiple independent melodic lines simultaneously, was, for several centuries, considered genuinely dangerous. The Catholic Church in the early medieval period was deeply ambivalent about musical complexity. Simple, unadorned chant was the ideal, one melody, one voice, directed entirely toward God. When singers began experimenting with harmonies, adding a second voice moving in parallel, then a third moving independently, church authorities grew concerned. In 1322, Pope John XXII issued a papal decree condemning the new polyphonic music that was spreading through the churches of Europe. The decree complained that the new music obscured the sacred texts with its complexity, that listeners were being moved more by the pleasure of the sound than by the devotion it was supposed to inspire, and that the music had become, in effect, a form of entertainment disguised as worship. He ordered a return to simplicity. The order was largely ignored. The composers kept composing. The singers kept adding voices. The music kept growing in complexity and beauty, and the Church, over the following century, gradually accommodated itself to the reality it could not prevent. The polyphonic tradition that Pope John XXII tried to suppress would go on to produce Palestrina, Josquin, Victoria, some of the most transcendent music in Western history. The dove on Gregory's shoulder turned out to have a very stubborn streak. The lute, the ancestor of the modern guitar, and the dominant plucked string instrument of Renaissance Europe, did not originate in Europe at all. It came from the Arab world. The oud, a short-necked, pear-shaped string instrument with a rounded back and no frets, had been played across the Arab world, Persia, and North Africa for well over 1,000 years before it arrived in Europe. The word lute itself is derived directly from the Arabic al-ud, meaning simply the wood. The oud traveled into Europe primarily through two routes, through the Moorish courts of medieval Spain, and through the Crusades, where European soldiers encountered instruments being played in the cities and camps of the Middle East and brought them home. By the 15th century, the lute had become the central instrument of European court music, the instrument of kings and nobles, the accompaniment to love songs and dances, the sound of Renaissance refinement. For 3 centuries, European composers wrote some of the most intricate and sophisticated music ever created for a solo string instrument, music of extraordinary delicacy and complexity, on an instrument that they had learned, across a cultural boundary, from a civilization they also feared and fought. The guitar that sits in the corner of a living room today is the oud's great-grandchild. The genealogy runs through Moorish Spain, through the courts of Renaissance Florence, through the taverns and theaters of Elizabethan England, to here. In medieval Europe, there was a category of professional musician whose social position was deeply ambiguous, simultaneously sought after and despised. They were called jongleurs in France, minstrels in England, spielute in the German-speaking lands. They traveled from town to town, from court to court, performing music, acrobatics, storytelling, and whatever else an audience would pay to see. The Church regarded them with deep suspicion. Councils and theologians debated whether a jongleur could be a Christian in good standing, whether the life of performance, with its association with wandering, pleasure, and the body, was compatible with salvation. Some authorities concluded that a jongleur who performed purely for money, with no higher purpose, was in a state of sin. And yet every court in Europe employed them. Every noble household wanted music at its feasts. Every cathedral city had musicians performing in its markets and squares. The theological anxiety about these performers ran alongside an absolute social dependence on what they provided. This tension between the musician as disreputable wanderer and the musician as indispensable craftsman of joy never fully resolved itself. Traces of it echo forward through history, in the suspicion with which respectable families once viewed careers in music, in the persistent idea that the artist lives slightly outside the normal rules, in the complicated relationship between performance and respectability that still, in certain rooms, makes itself felt today. The piano, the instrument that sits at the center of Western classical music, the one most children are sent to learn, the one whose shape defines what musical instrument looks like in the popular imagination, was invented in Florence, Italy, around the year 1700. Its inventor was a harpsichord maker named Bartolomeo Cristofori, who was employed by the Medici family. The harpsichord, which the piano replaced, had one fundamental limitation: the volume of its sound could not be varied by the touch of the player. The mechanism that plucked the strings produced the same force regardless of how hard or softly the key was pressed. A harpsichordist could not play quietly and then loudly for emphasis. Every note spoke at the same volume, which gave the instrument a kind of brilliant but emotionally limited clarity. Cristofori's insight was to replace the plucking mechanism with a hammer, a small felt-covered hammer that struck the string and then immediately bounced away, allowing the string to vibrate freely. The harder the key was pressed, the harder the hammer struck, the louder the sound. For the first time, a keyboard instrument could whisper and shout, could shade its dynamics with the sensitivity of a human hand. He called it the gravissembolo col piano e forte, the harpsichord with soft and loud. The world shortened this, eventually, to piano. The instrument that emerged from this single craftsman's workshop in Florence would reshape all of Western music. It would give Beethoven the full force of his storms and his silences. It would give Chopin the delicacy of his nocturnes. It would eventually, traveling through many transformations, give birth to the blues, jazz, and everything that followed. The symphony orchestra, the large ensemble of strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion that performs in concert halls around the world, did not emerge from a single tradition or a single place. It assembled itself gradually, over roughly 2 centuries, as different instruments were invented, perfected, standardized, and absorbed into a growing collective. In the early 17th century, ensembles were small and variable. A composer wrote for whatever instruments were available at the particular court or church where the music would be performed. There was no standard. A piece written in Vienna might call for instruments that did not exist in London. A composer traveling between courts had to rewrite constantly, adapting to local resources. The movement toward standardization began in the courts of France under Louis XIV, who employed the composer Jean-Baptiste Lully to organize the royal music establishment. Lully created something like a house style, a set of expectations about instrumentation and form that began to spread through Europe as French cultural influence spread. By the time of Haydn and Mozart in the late 18th century, the basic architecture of the symphony orchestra had been established, strings at the core, woodwinds and brass adding color and weight, timpani providing rhythmic punctuation. It was still flexible, still evolving. But its fundamental shape, the shape that remains recognizable today, was in place. The orchestra did not begin as an artistic ideal. It began as a practical solution to the problem of how to fill a large room with sound using the instruments that happened to exist. Opera, the art form in which singers perform dramatic narratives with full orchestral accompaniment, was invented in Florence, Italy, at the end of the 16th century. And it was invented by a committee. A group of Florentine intellectuals, poets, musicians, and aristocrats who called themselves the Camerata met regularly at the house of a nobleman named Giovanni de Bardi to discuss the state of music and theater. They were obsessed with ancient Greece. They believed incorrectly, as it turned out, but productively, that ancient Greek drama had been performed entirely in song, and that this was the secret of its legendary power over audiences. Their goal was to recreate this lost art form. The result, premiered around 1598, was something genuinely new in the world, a theatrical work in which the entire text was sung, in which the music served the drama rather than decorating it, in which the emotional content of the story was expressed through the voice in real time. The first operas were modest affairs, small casts, small audiences, performed in private palaces. Within 50 years, opera had become the dominant entertainment form of European courts, and within a century it had spread across the continent, transforming every musical tradition it touched. The Camerata wanted to bring ancient Greece back to life. What they created instead was something no Greek had ever imagined. But then, most of the greatest inventions in human history were not built to become what they became. The blues, the musical tradition from which most popular music of the 20th century descended, emerged from the American South in the decades following the Civil War. Its deepest roots lie in the work songs, field hollers, and spiritual music of enslaved Africans and their descendants. The field holler was a form of solo vocal expression not structured as a song in any formal sense, but as a cry, a call, an extended improvised vocalization that a single person working alone in a field might make to communicate across distance, to mark time, or simply to release something that had no other outlet. The blue notes, the slightly flattened thirds and sevenths that give the blues its distinctive emotional color, appear to trace back to the tonal systems of West African musical traditions, carried across the Atlantic in human memory. What makes this lineage remarkable is how it traveled. From the fields of Mississippi and Louisiana, through the juke joints and levee camps of the post-war South, into the cities of Chicago and Detroit and New York as African Americans migrated north in the early 20th century. From there it fed into jazz, into rhythm and blues, into rock and roll, into soul, into virtually every genre of popular music that followed. The field holler of a man working alone in a Louisiana cotton field in 1880 is the ancestor of almost everything on the radio today. That line runs straight, through many transformations, but without a break. Jazz, the improvisational American music that emerged in New Orleans at the turn of the 20th century, combined at least four distinct musical traditions into something that had never existed before. African rhythmic complexity. European harmonic vocabulary. The blues feeling and its bent notes. And the brass band tradition brought to New Orleans by its unique history as a French and Spanish colonial city, where public brass band performances had been a feature of civic life for generations. The neighborhood of Storyville, New Orleans' legally sanctioned red light district, which existed from 1897 to 1917, played a specific and complicated role in jazz's early development. It was one of the few places in the rigidly segregated South where black and Creole musicians could find consistent paid work, performing in the clubs, dance halls, and brothels that filled the district's streets. The musicians who played there were developing something in real time, experimenting nightly with what the music could do, how far from the melody they could stray before losing the thread, what a trumpet and a clarinet and a trombone could say to each other without prearrangement. When Storyville was forcibly closed by the U.S. Navy Department in 1917 on the grounds that it was too close to a naval training facility, the musicians dispersed. They went north, to Chicago, to New York, to Kansas City. And the music they carried with them went everywhere they went. The microphone, the device that made it possible for a single human voice to fill an auditorium of thousands, that transformed singing from a physical feat into an intimate art, was not invented for music. It was invented for the telephone. The carbon microphone, developed in the late 1870s independently by both Emil Berliner and Thomas Edison, was designed to improve the clarity and range of the telephone transmitter. It was a communication technology, not a musical one. Its application to performance, to broadcasting, to recording, to amplifying singers on a stage, came later, gradually, as radio and then the recording industry developed in the early 20th century. The microphone fundamentally changed what a singer needed to be. Before amplification, performing in large spaces required a voice of extraordinary power and projection, a voice trained for years in the specific skill of filling a hall. The great operatic tradition developed in this world, and its vocal aesthetic, the resonant, large-tone sound that carries without electronic assistance, was shaped entirely by acoustic necessity. With the microphone, a singer could be quiet. Could whisper, almost. Could communicate with the intimacy of a conversation rather than the declamation of a performance. The crooners of the 1930s and 1940s, Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, understood this immediately. They were the first generation of singers who could sound as if they were singing only to you. The recording of sound, the ability to capture a musical performance and play it back in the absence of the performer, was considered, when it was first demonstrated, to be either miraculous or deeply unsettling. Thomas Edison demonstrated his phonograph in 1877, and the reaction was one of genuine astonishment. A reporter who attended an early demonstration wrote that the experience of hearing a recorded voice was like nothing previously imaginable, the voice of a person, present in the room, with no person there. Some people found it wonderful. Others found it uncanny in a way that was difficult to articulate. There was something about hearing sound divorced from its source, from the body, the face, the living presence that had produced it, that disturbed the natural order of things in ways that took time to adjust to. The music industry that grew from recording technology was not inevitable. Edison himself believed that the primary use of the phonograph would be for dictating business letters. He did not foresee that the technology for capturing sound would, within a few decades, become the primary means by which music was experienced, that it would transform music from a communal, live, local event into something a person could carry in their pocket. The idea that music is something you listen to alone, through a device, in private, something you consume rather than participate in, is historically extremely recent. For most of human history, music was something you were inside of, not something that played in the background of something else. Rock and roll, the genre that defined the second half of the 20th century and whose descendants still dominate popular music globally, has a name with a specific and somewhat euphemistic origin. The phrase rock and roll was used in African American communities in the 1930s and 1940s as a description of both dancing and, in certain contexts, sexual activity. When disc jockey Alan Freed began using the term in the early 1950s to describe the rhythm and blues music he was playing on his Cleveland radio show, partly as a way of marketing it to white audiences without explicitly identifying it as black music, he was adopting language that already existed. The music itself was not new either. What Freed and others were calling rock and roll was rhythm and blues, the electric, amplified, danceable evolution of the blues tradition repackaged and represented for a new demographic. The artists who had been creating it for years, primarily black musicians working in a segregated industry that paid them a fraction of what their music earned, watched as white artists recorded note-for-note versions of their songs and achieved the mainstream success that had been denied the originals. The history of rock and roll is, in part, a story about who gets credited for what, and about how cultural transmission moves across boundaries of race and commerce in ways that are rarely fair and rarely fully acknowledged. The electric guitar, the instrument most associated with rock and roll, country music, jazz, and blues in the 20th century, was not invented to be louder. It was invented to be heard at all. In the dance bands of the 1930s, the guitar was a rhythm instrument strummed in the background to provide harmonic support for horns and piano. The problem was acoustic. In a large, noisy dance hall, the unamplified guitar simply could not be heard over the brass section. Guitarists were present but essentially inaudible. They were keeping time in a room that couldn't hear them. Various inventors and musicians worked on the problem through the 1930s. The solution was electromagnetic pickups, devices that sensed the vibration of the metal strings and converted it to an electrical signal that could be amplified and played through a speaker. The instrument that resulted had a completely different sonic character than an acoustic guitar: sustain where the acoustic had decay, edge where the acoustic had warmth, a voice that could cut through or overwhelm any ensemble. When the electric guitar moved from the dance band to the blues stage to the rock and roll band of the 1950s, it took its originally practical invention with it and discovered what else it could do. It could scream. It could whisper. It could produce sounds no acoustic instrument had ever made. The instrument built to be heard in a dance hall became the instrument that defined an era. For most of human history, the concept of a composer, a single-named individual who created a piece of music as a fixed, complete, authored work, did not exist. Music was tradition. It belonged to the community that performed it. Songs evolved over generations, passed from parent to child, from master to apprentice, accumulating changes and variations the way a river accumulates silt. The idea that a piece of music had a single author whose name should be preserved was a relatively recent development, tied to specific cultural and legal shifts in European history. The rise of musical notation, the ability to write music down as a fixed text, made authorship both possible and necessary. Once a piece of music existed as a stable, reproducible document, it became something that could be owned, copied, sold, and stolen. The question of who had made it became a legal and commercial question, not just an aesthetic one. The first composers whose names are reliably associated with specific surviving works lived in the medieval period, figures like Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century, whose compositions survive and are still performed today. But even this is a kind of retroactive authorship, applied by later generations who found documents with names attached. The vast majority of music in human history was made by people whose names were never recorded, who did not think of themselves as authors, who simply played what they knew and taught it to whoever would learn. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, theologian, and composer, produced one of the largest surviving bodies of music from the entire medieval period. She was, by the standards of her time and any other, an extraordinary figure. And yet she was also, by the social structures of her era, someone who should not have had a public voice at all. Women in the medieval Catholic Church were not supposed to preach, teach publicly, or produce theological or artistic works for general consumption. The space available to a woman of intellect and ambition was narrow and tightly bounded. Hildegard worked within it by claiming, consistently, that her compositions and her writings were not her own. They were, she maintained, received directly from God, visions, voices, illuminations that she was merely transcribing. This framework of divine dictation rather than personal authorship was not simply strategic, though it was certainly that. It reflected a genuine medieval understanding of creative inspiration as something that came from outside the self. Hildegard's music is formally sophisticated, harmonically unusual for its period, and marked by an expressive range that no claim of passive transcription fully accounts for. She lived to be 81 in a century where 40 was old age. Her music survived 900 years and is now performed in concert halls and recorded by modern ensembles. Whatever voice she was transcribing, it had a very distinctive sound. The concept of the concert, a public performance of music for a paying audience of strangers, is surprisingly recent. For most of European history, music was either sacred, performed in churches for congregations, or private, performed in aristocratic households for invited guests. There was no institution of the public concert in the modern sense. Music was attached to contexts, to worship, to celebration, to the entertainment of specific patrons. A musician performed where they were told to perform, for the people who had hired them. The first regular public concerts for which tickets were sold began appearing in London in the late 17th century. A violinist named John Bannister is often credited with organizing the first such series in 1672, charging a modest admission and inviting any paying customer to attend. It was, by the standards of the time, a strange and slightly transgressive idea that music, previously the exclusive property of churches and noble courts, could be sold to whoever had a coin. The concept spread slowly, then rapidly. By the mid-18th century, public concert halls were being built across Europe. By the 19th century, the orchestral concert had become the central cultural institution of the urban middle class, a place to be seen, to signal refinement, and, sometimes, to listen. The distance between John Bannister's modest admission-charging experiment in a London tavern and the modern concert hall is vast. But the line between them is direct. The waltz, the dance in which partners hold each other close and rotate together, was considered deeply scandalous when it first appeared in European ballrooms at the end of the 18th century. The scandal was about proximity. In earlier European court dances, the minuet, the quadrille, the polonaise, partners moved in prescribed patterns, approaching and retreating, touching at the hands, maintaining a formal distance for the rest. The choreography was social performance, a display of grace, deportment, and proper breeding. The body was present but controlled, regulated, never fully released into the music. The waltz required something different. Partners faced each other directly, placed one hand on the other's waist, and moved together in close physical contact for the duration of the dance. It was intimate in a way that polite European society had not, in formal contexts, previously accommodated. When the waltz arrived in England around 1812, a scathing article in the Times warned of its corrupting influence. Lord Byron wrote a satirical poem about it. Medical doctors published pamphlets arguing that the rotational motion was physically harmful. Within a generation, the waltz was the most popular dance in Europe, played in every ballroom from Vienna to St. Petersburg. What had seemed transgressive became the very definition of elegant social dancing. The scandal faded, as scandals do, into the perfectly ordinary. National anthems, the musical symbols of sovereign states, sung at sporting events and official ceremonies across the world, are, in historical terms, a very recent invention. Most national anthems were composed in the 19th century, during the period of intense nationalist sentiment that swept Europe and the Americas following the French and American revolutions. The idea that a nation should have its own distinct musical identity, a song that embodied the collective spirit of the people, was part of the broader project of constructing national identity out of populations that had previously identified primarily with their local region, their religion, or their social class. The oldest national anthem still in use is generally considered to be the Dutch Wilhelmus, whose lyrics date to the 1570s, though its adoption as an official anthem came much later. The Star-Spangled Banner, now the national anthem of the United States, has a particularly layered origin. Its lyrics were written in 1814 by a lawyer named Francis Scott Key, watching the British bombardment of Fort McHenry from a ship in Baltimore Harbor. The melody he set them to was an existing English drinking song, a popular tune from the Anacreontic Society, a London gentlemen's club for amateur musicians. The song that Americans stand for at sporting events, Hand on Heart, was built on the skeleton of a British pub song. The origins of things are rarely as solemn as the things themselves eventually become. For most of Western classical music history, the conductor, the person who stands in front of the orchestra with a baton and directs the performance, did not exist. Orchestras performed without conductors for centuries. The group was led from within, usually by the principal violinist, who would indicate tempo changes with the bow, or by the keyboard player, who provided a harmonic anchor and could signal phrasing with head movements. It was a more democratic arrangement than what replaced it, and it worked as long as the ensembles remained relatively small. As orchestras grew larger through the 18th and 19th centuries, more players, more instruments, more complex scores, the need for centralized direction became apparent. The first conductors used their hands, or a rolled-up sheet of music, or a violin bow. The baton was adopted gradually, its short wooden form giving the conductor a visible point of focus for the players at the far edges of an expanding ensemble. The modern conductor is a figure of almost mystical authority, the interpreter through whom the music flows. The single individual whose vision shapes the entire performance is largely a creation of the Romantic era. Composers like Wagner and Berlioz wrote extensively about the ideal of conducting as an act of recreation rather than mere coordination. The image of the conductor as the most important person in the room, facing away from the audience, commanding dozens of musicians with the movement of a small stick, is historically strange and relatively recent. And it still, if you think about it, looks like exactly what it is. Ludwig van Beethoven began losing his hearing in his mid-20s and composed the majority of his most celebrated work while significantly or profoundly deaf. The nature of his hearing loss has been analyzed extensively by modern medical researchers. The most probable diagnosis is otosclerosis combined with other conditions that together resulted in a progressive, ultimately total loss. By his late 40s, Beethoven could not hear the piano at all. He communicated with visitors through written notebooks, hundreds of which survive, and famously sawed the legs off pianos to feel the vibration through the floor. The music he composed during the last decade of his life, the final piano sonatas, the Missa Solemnis, the Ninth Symphony, is widely considered among the most profound ever written. It was music he composed entirely from within his own mental and musical imagination, without the feedback loop of hearing what he was writing. The Ninth Symphony premiered in Vienna in 1824. Beethoven stood on stage during the performance, not conducting, but following the score and indicating tempo changes. When the symphony ended, the audience erupted in applause. Beethoven did not turn around. He could not hear the applause. A soloist turned him gently to face the audience so he could see what he could not hear. The painting of that moment, the deaf composer turned to face the ovation he could not receive, has become one of the defining images of what art costs and what it gives back. The music box, the small mechanical device that produces melody through a rotating cylinder with pins that pluck tuned metal tines, was invented in Switzerland in the late 18th century. Its origin was watchmaking. The Swiss watchmaking industry, centered in the Jura region, had developed extraordinary precision in the manufacture of small mechanical components. A watchmaker named Antoine Favre Salomon applied this precision to sound in 1796, creating a mechanism small enough to fit inside a pocket watch that could produce a recognizable melody without any human action beyond winding the spring. The music box was the first device in human history capable of playing music without a human performer. It anticipated the phonograph by almost a century, and the concept it introduced, stored, reproducible, automatic music, was genuinely new in the world. They became objects of fascination across Europe and beyond. Wealthy households owned them as luxury items. They were placed in jewelry boxes, snuff boxes, automata of extraordinary complexity, mechanical birds that sang, dancing figures that moved to their own music. The desire to make sound independent of the human body, to capture music in an object, to have it available at will, is evidently very old. The music box wound down, eventually, replaced by better technologies. But the longing it answered never went away. Silence, the absence of music, has itself been composed. John Cage's 4 feet 33 inches premiered in August 1952 at the Maverick Concert Hall in Woodstock, New York. The work consists of 3 movements, during each of which the performer, a pianist, sits at the instrument without playing. The duration is 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The composition was, and remains, either a profound statement about the nature of music and listening, or an elaborate provocation, or both. Cage's intention was to direct the audience's attention to the sounds that always exist in any space, the ambient noise of the room, the breathing of listeners, the distant sounds outside the walls, and to ask whether the distinction between music and sound is a distinction the ear makes or one that the mind imposes. The premiere audience was reportedly restless and confused. Some were angry. One supporter of the concert hall threatened to cut down the trees Cage walked through every day. What Cage was pointing at, the idea that music is not an object but a kind of attention, that it exists in the listener's relationship to sound rather than in the sound itself, was not a new idea. It echoed arguments that had been made in various forms across many traditions, in Zen Buddhism, in certain strands of Western music philosophy, in the thinking of composers who had long been suspicious of music's tendency to become decoration. 4 feet 33 inches made the argument audibly. Which is perhaps the only honest way to make an argument about sound. The human voice is the only instrument that exists in every culture in every period of human history without exception. Every other instrument, the drum, the flute, the lute, the violin, the piano, is the result of deliberate construction, of specific materials and specific knowledge assembled in a specific place in time. They can be lost. The knowledge of how to make them can disappear. There are instruments from ancient civilizations whose construction we can see in paintings and carvings but whose sound we will never hear, because no one who knew how to make them survived to teach anyone else. But the voice cannot be lost. Every human being born into the world arrives with it already in place, already capable, in infancy, of producing pitch, rhythm, and variation. Before any instrument was carved or stretched or blown into, the voice was there. It is the instrument that required no invention. And yet the human voice can be trained, developed, and shaped in ways that would seem almost impossible without evidence. The operatic tenor who can project a note to the back of a 3,000-seat auditorium without amplification, sustaining it over a full orchestra, has taken a biological given and developed it into something that approaches the limit of what a human body can do. The gap between the first human sound and the last note of a great operatic performance is both enormous and nothing at all. It is the same instrument, in the same body, doing what it always did. Lullabies, the songs sung to infants to help them sleep, are among the oldest and most universal forms of music in human history. Every culture that has ever been documented has them. They appear in ancient Babylonian texts. They exist in the oral traditions of indigenous peoples on every inhabited continent. They are present in ancient Sanskrit, in ancient Greek, in ancient Egyptian records. Before a child can understand a single word, before it can walk or hold a cup or recognize its own face in a reflection, it can be calmed and guided towards sleep by a human voice singing a simple, repetitive melody. The musicologist Sandra Trahub has spent decades studying how infants respond to music, and her research suggests that the perception of musical structure, the ability to track melody and rhythm, is not learned. It is present at birth, possibly before. Premature infants in intensive care units who are exposed to lullabies show measurable improvements in weight gain, oxygen saturation, and overall health outcomes. What this suggests is that music did not begin as art. It did not begin as ritual or as entertainment or as communication with the divine, though it became all of those things. It began as the sound of one person trying to bring peace to another, a parent, in the dark, singing to a child who could not yet understand a single word but who could hear the intention behind the sound. That may be the oldest human music of all. And it still works exactly the same way it always did. The frequency 432 Hz, a slight lowering of the standard modern musical tuning of 440 Hz, has, in recent decades, attracted a devoted following of people who believe it carries special healing or spiritual properties. The actual history of musical tuning tells a more complicated story. There has never been a single universal pitch standard in the history of Western music. Before standardization, orchestras in different cities tuned to different reference pitches, some higher, some lower, depending on local tradition, the preferences of instrument makers, and the capabilities of the singers who performed with them. The pitch that orchestras used drifted upward through the 19th century as audiences came to prefer the brighter, more exciting sound of higher tuning. The standard of a 440 Hz for the note A above middle C was adopted as an international standard by a conference in London in 1939. It was a practical, administrative decision, made to allow instruments from different countries to play together in tune. It was not chosen for mystical or aesthetic reasons. It was chosen because it was in the middle of the range most orchestras were already using. The attachment to 432 Hz as a special or ancient frequency has no historical basis. But it reflects something genuine, the persistent human sense that music exists in a relationship with something larger than convention, and that the right vibration might, if found, open something in the world that ordinary sound cannot reach. The drum kit, the collection of drums and cymbals played by a single-seated musician using both hands and both feet, did not exist before the 20th century. It was invented by economic necessity. In the late 19th century, bands in American vaudeville theaters, saloons, and dance halls typically employed multiple percussionists. One played the bass drum, one the snare, others handled various cymbals and accessories. As costs rose and margins tightened, theater owners began looking for ways to reduce the number of musicians on the payroll. The solution was mechanical. A foot pedal for the bass drum, invented around 1909, allowed a single player to operate the bass drum with a foot while using both hands for the snare and cymbals. From there, the development of the hi-hat, a pair of cymbals operated by a second foot pedal, gave one player complete control of the full percussion section. The musician who emerged from this economic compression was a new kind of performer, someone who could coordinate four independent limbs in different rhythmic patterns simultaneously, maintaining a steady pulse with the feet while improvising fills with the hands. The technical demands this created were unprecedented. The drum kit, the instrument that drives every rock band, every jazz ensemble, every popular music performance in the modern world, was assembled from cost-cutting pressures in early 20th century American entertainment. It was not designed. It was economized into existence. In certain traditional cultures, specific musical knowledge was considered sacred property, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a legal and social one. Among some indigenous Australian groups, ceremonial songs were owned by specific lineages and could not be sung by those who had not inherited the right. The songs were not merely expressions of tradition. They were the tradition itself, they were the means by which the country was maintained, by which relationships between groups were defined, by which the spiritual landscape was kept in order. To sing a song you did not have the right to sing was not a matter of social awkwardness. It was a serious transgression with consequences that could include social exclusion, dispute, or worse. The songs were not entertainment. They were custodianship. Similar frameworks existed in other cultures, in the griotic tradition of West Africa, where certain families held hereditary responsibility for preserving and transmitting historical and genealogical knowledge and song, in the bardic traditions of Celtic Europe, where poets and musicians held legal status and their work was protected by specific laws. The idea that music belongs to whoever hears it, that a melody, once released into the air, becomes common property, is a very specific and historically recent cultural assumption. For most of human history, in most parts of the world, music was more like land than air. It had owners. It had boundaries. And crossing them without permission was understood to have weight. The very oldest melodies in human memory may be the calls used by early humans to communicate across distance, sounds that were not yet music but that carried the seeds of everything music would become. Researchers studying the relationship between language and music have proposed that the two did not develop separately. The musicologist Stephen Mithen has argued that early humans communicated through a system he calls holistic, manipulative, multimodal, musical, and mimetic, a kind of proto-language that was simultaneously communicative and musical, that used pitch, rhythm, and tone as an integrated system before they separated into distinct faculties. On this view, language and music did not diverge from silence. They diverged from each other. The human capacity for grammar, for combining symbols according to rules to produce infinite meanings, split from the human capacity for melody, for combining sounds to produce emotional and social effect. They are not opposites or unrelated arts. They are siblings who grew up and stopped recognizing each other. This may explain why music still does things to human beings that language alone cannot. Why a piece of music can produce grief or joy in a person who cannot identify why, who has no specific memory attached to the sound, no words to explain what is happening. The sound arrives at somewhere older than words. It arrives at the place where, a very long time ago, sound and meaning were the same thing. The recording industry's most dominant format for most of the 20th century, the vinyl record, almost did not survive the transition to the digital age. Vinyl record sales fell dramatically through the 1980s and 1990s as CDs replaced them as the primary format. By the early 2000s, major labels had largely stopped pressing vinyl. Record pressing plants closed. The infrastructure for producing records at scale was dismantled or mothballed. And then, in the 2010s, vinyl sales began rising again, slowly at first, then rapidly. By 2020, for the first time since the late 1980s, more revenue was generated by vinyl records in the United States than by CDs. In 2021, vinyl outsold CDs for the first time in decades. The reasons for the revival are multiple and debated. Some listeners prefer the sound quality, the warmth of analog reproduction versus the precision of digital. Some value the physical ritual of handling a record, lowering a needle, committing to a full side. Some were simply responding to an aesthetic that had become, through its own obsolescence, nostalgic. What vinyl's revival suggests is something about the relationship between music and objects, about the human desire to hold music in the hands, to have it take up space, to give it a kind of weight that a digital file cannot possess. The music is the same. but the object around it changes what the music means. The whistled languages, systems in which complex spoken language is replaced by musical whistles, used to communicate across mountain valleys and long distances, exist on at least 4 continents. The Mazatec people of Mexico, the Silbo-Gomero speakers of the Canary Islands, certain communities in the Turkish mountains, groups in the Pyrenees, in Papua New Guinea, in West Africa, all developed independent systems in which the tonal and rhythmic features of their spoken language were transposed into whistled sound, capable of carrying meaning across distances of several kilometers that a spoken voice could not reach. Silbo-Gomero, the whistled language of La Gomera in the Canary Islands, encodes the phonemic content of Spanish into whistle tones and is still used today. Neuroimaging studies of Silbo speakers have shown that their brains process the whistled sounds in the same language centers used for speech, not in the music processing areas, where whistling by non-speakers is routed. What this means is that music and language, for these communities, live in even closer proximity than usual. The whistle is not an imitation of language or a substitute for it. It is language, the same cognitive content, carried on a different physical medium. The voice turned into a single pure tone, traveling over a mountain because it needed to reach someone on the other side. The theremin, the electronic instrument played without physical contact, controlled entirely by the movement of the player's hands through the air, was invented in Soviet Russia in 1920. Its inventor, Lev Termen, known in the West as Leon Theremin, was a physicist who had been working on proximity sensors for the Soviet government, devices that could detect the presence of a person near a protected area. While experimenting with the circuitry, he noticed that moving his hand near the device changed the pitch of the electrical oscillation it produced. He turned this observation into a musical instrument. By 1927, he was touring Europe and the United States with it, performing to audiences who had never seen anything like it, a musician standing before a plain wooden box, hands moving through empty air, producing sounds that seemed to emerge from nothing, from pure gesture. The theremin wavering tone, produced by the beat frequency between 2 radio frequency oscillators, became the signature sound of science fiction film scores in the 1950s. It spoke of the uncanny and the alien, of worlds beyond the familiar. Which is an interesting fate for an instrument whose origin lay in Soviet surveillance technology. It became the sound of the unknown because the sounds it made seemed to come from a space between objects, from the air itself, from a place the hand moved through but could not quite touch. The music of the spheres, the ancient belief that the planets and their orbits produce a cosmic harmony inaudible to human ears, is one of the longest-lived ideas in the history of human thought. It originates with Pythagoras in the 6th century BCE, who believed he could hear this music directly, a claim his followers accepted as evidence of his extraordinary nature. The Pythagoreans had discovered that musical harmonics correspond to simple mathematical ratios. An octave is produced by a string half the length of its partner, a fifth by a string 2/3 the length, and so on. They believed, and the elegance of their discovery made this feel self-evident, that the universe was ordered by the same mathematical principles, and that the planetary motions therefore produced a music too vast and too constant for ordinary human senses to perceive. The idea was preserved through the medieval period in the concept of musica universalis, a music of the cosmos that undergirded all earthly sound. It influenced the placement of music in the medieval curriculum alongside arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy as one of the 4 mathematical arts. Johannes Kepler, in the 17th century, devoted a substantial portion of his Harmonics Mundi, published in 1619, the year before he helped formulate the laws of planetary motion, to working out the musical intervals produced by the elliptical orbits of the planets. He was a rigorous mathematician and astronomer. He also believed, completely sincerely, that the solar system was a piece of music. He may not have been entirely wrong. In 2013, NASA released recordings made from the pressure waves in the plasma surrounding the Sun, converted to audible frequencies. They sound, remarkably, like a chord. The most commercially successful piece of music in American history may be a song most people assume has existed forever. Happy Birthday to You was composed in 1893 by two sisters, Mildred J. Hill and Patty Smith Hill, as a classroom greeting song called Good Morning to All. The melody was Mildred's. The words Happy Birthday to You were substituted sometime before 1912 by unknown parties. The song began appearing in print without attribution, spreading through American popular culture through the first decades of the 20th century. In 1935, a publishing company claimed copyright on the song and began collecting royalties. For decades, the song was under copyright protection, which meant that using it publicly, in films, television shows, or commercial settings, required paying a licensing fee. Restaurants famously developed their own alternative birthday songs specifically to avoid this obligation. The copyright was challenged in court, and in 2016, a federal judge ruled that the 1935 copyright claim had never been valid, that Happy Birthday to You, having been in wide public use for decades, belonged to the public domain. The melody that more human beings have sung together than any other piece of music in history, the one sung in every language, at every birthday, on every continent, was invented by two schoolteachers in Kentucky, derived from a classroom greeting, and then quietly owned by a corporation for most of a century. The song was always the same. What changed, for a while, was who it belonged to. The connection between music and memory is among the most studied and most astonishing phenomena in all of neuroscience. Music activates more areas of the brain simultaneously than almost any other stimulus. It engages the auditory cortex, the motor system, the limbic system, the emotional core of the brain, and the prefrontal cortex, which handles higher cognitive functions. It does this in a way that few other experiences replicate, and one consequence of this broad activation is that musical memories are stored with unusual durability and emotional specificity. The most dramatic evidence of this comes from patients with severe Alzheimer's disease. People who have lost the ability to recognize their own children, who cannot recall their own names or where they live or what year it is, can frequently still sing songs from their youth in full. The musical memories survive the disease longer than almost any other form of memory, stored, apparently, in neural pathways that the disease reaches last. Oliver Sacks, the neurologist who spent decades studying the brain's relationship to music, documented dozens of cases in which music served as a temporary key to otherwise locked minds, restoring, for the duration of a familiar song, a person who had seemed entirely absent. After the music stopped, the absence returned. But for those minutes, something persisted. It is as if the music is encoded not merely as memory but as identity, as part of the structure of the self rather than its contents. And that may be, in the end, the deepest answer to the question of why music has accompanied human beings from the first carved bone flute to this present moment. It is not decoration. It is not entertainment. It is one of the ways we know who we are. The interval of a tritone, 3 whole tones apart, exactly in the middle of the octave, was called diabolus in musica in medieval European music theory. The devil in music. The name reflected a genuine anxiety. In the modal system that governed medieval polyphony, the tritone was the one interval that seemed to resist resolution. It created a tension that demanded movement but did not resolve cleanly in either direction. It sounded wrong in a way that other dissonances did not. Theorists warned composers to avoid it. Students were taught to fear it. The prohibition was not merely aesthetic. The identification of a musical interval with the devil reflected the medieval belief that certain sounds had moral properties, that music could align the soul with good or evil depending on the intervals it used. The tritone was not just ugly. It was dangerous. The history of Western music can partly be told as a story of which dissonances were gradually domesticated, brought into musical language, given resolutions, made acceptable, then beautiful, then necessary. The tritone was used sparingly for centuries, then adopted cautiously by composers of the Renaissance, then more boldly by the Baroque masters, then with full intention by later composers who understood exactly what they were reaching for. By the 20th century, the tritone was everywhere, in jazz, in blues, in film scores, in heavy metal, where its dissonance was precisely the point. Black Sabbath's opening riff, often cited as the birth of heavy metal, is built on a tritone. The devil in the music had been there all along. It just took a few centuries to stop apologizing for it. Castrating male singers who were castrated before puberty to preserve their high vocal range dominated the operatic stages of Europe for nearly 2 centuries. The practice began in 16th century Italy, where women were forbidden from performing in church choirs and on certain theatrical stages. The solution was to create male singers capable of singing the high parts. Boys whose voices showed exceptional promise were castrated before the onset of puberty, preventing the hormonal changes that would lower the voice. The physical effects of prepubertal castration combined with the continued growth of the body produced voices of remarkable power and range. The castrato's lungs and chest developed to adult proportions while the larynx remained small, creating a combination of breath support and vocal agility that no other type of voice could match. Contemporary accounts describe the sound as otherworldly, capable of volume surpassing a soprano, with an agility exceeding a countertenor, sustained over a range of notes that should have been physically impossible. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the most famous castrati were among the most celebrated artists in Europe, paid more than royalty, mobbed by crowds, and the subjects of a veneration that modern observers find difficult to reconcile with the violence done to them in childhood. The last castrato to sing professionally was Alessandro Morici, who died in 1922. He made recordings in 1902 and 1904, the only recordings ever made of a castrato voice. They are strange and affecting documents, a voice from a world that has since disappeared entirely, singing music written for something that can no longer exist. For most of human history, the experience of hearing a particular piece of music required being physically present where that music was being performed. If you wanted to hear a specific symphony, you had to be in the hall on the night it was played. If the hall was in a different city, you traveled there or you never heard it. If the composer died before you were born, you could read the score but you could not hear the sound. Music was, in the most literal sense, perishable. It existed only in performance, only in the present tense. This perishability shaped everything about how music was experienced and valued. A concert was an event in a way nothing digital can replicate, not because concerts were better, but because they were irreplaceable. The music that was happening in that room, at that moment, was happening nowhere else and would never happen in exactly that way again. The philosopher Walter Benjamin wrote in 1935 about what he called the aura of an artwork, the quality of presence, of being embedded in a specific time and place, that is lost when an artwork is mechanically reproduced. He was writing primarily about visual art, but the observation applies even more precisely to music. Recorded music gave the world something extraordinary: access, preservation, portability. It also changed, permanently, what music felt like. The aura did not disappear entirely. It retreated to the concert hall, to the live performance, to the unrepeatable event. Which may be why people still buy tickets and stand in lines and crowd into rooms where a musician is present, even when they own every recording that musician has ever made. Something is still there, in the room, that is not on the recording. The xylophone, a percussion instrument whose wooden bars produce distinct pitches when struck, has ancient roots in Southeast Asia and Africa that significantly predate its arrival in Western music. The earliest evidence of xylophone-like instruments comes from Southeast Asia, where instruments with suspended wooden bars appear in temple carvings dating to the 9th century CE. Similar instruments developed independently in sub-Saharan Africa, where the balafon, a wooden-keyed instrument with gourd resonators, has been documented for at least 1,000 years and remains central to the musical traditions of many West African cultures. The instrument arrived in Europe in the 16th century, carried by travelers and traders. It appears in a German publication from 1511 as an unusual curiosity, described as an instrument heard from traveler accounts, played by striking wooden bars arranged in a row. It was for centuries considered exotic, peripheral, an instrument associated with folk music and curiosity rather than serious composition. Its rehabilitation in Western classical music came in the 19th century, when Saint-Saëns used it in Danse Macabre in 1874, specifically to evoke the image of dancing skeletons. The dry, percussive attack of the wooden bars suggested rattling bones. The instrument's association with death and the otherworldly in Western ears, an association that has nothing to do with its original cultural contexts, which were varied and rich and had nothing to do with skeletons, began there and proved surprisingly durable. The bagpipe, an instrument most associated with Scotland, but present in various forms across Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia, may have originated not in the British Isles but in ancient Mesopotamia. Instruments matching the description of bagpipes, a bag of air with attached pipes, appear in ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian sources. The Roman Emperor Nero was reported by Suetonius to have been skilled at playing a tibia utricularis, a bagpipe-like instrument. There are references to similar instruments in ancient Greek literature. The instrument appears to have spread across the known world along trade and military routes, taking root in different forms in different cultures. The Highland bagpipe of Scotland, the version most recognized globally, developed its distinctive form and its association with Scottish military and ceremonial culture during the medieval period, and its most intense cultural association dates to the 17th and 18th centuries. The sound of the bagpipe has a particular quality that sets it apart from most other instruments, the drone. While the chanter pipe plays the melody, the drone pipes sustain a constant, unvarying note beneath it, creating a harmonic foundation that the melody moves against. This creates a sound that is simultaneously ancient and insistent, a single note held for as long as the player can keep the bag filled, a note that does not resolve or change, that simply continues as the melody rises and falls above it. Some musicologists believe the drone is one of the oldest musical concepts in human history, the first harmony, the first recognition that two different sounds could coexist and create something neither could make alone. The kora, a 21-string instrument played by the griot tradition of West Africa, is built from a calabash gourd, a wooden neck, and a cowhide bridge. It produces a sound that occupies a strange and beautiful space between the harp, the lute, and something that has no Western equivalent. The griot tradition, hereditary musicians, historians, and social chroniclers found across many cultures of West Africa, is among the most ancient continuous musical and literary traditions in the world. Griots serve as the living memory of their communities, preserving genealogies, historical accounts, and moral teachings in song. Their knowledge is transmitted orally from parent to child across generations, the songs themselves carrying information that in other cultures would be written in books. The kora was developed, according to tradition, several centuries ago, though its exact origin is disputed among historians. What is documented is that it has been the instrument of the Mande griot tradition for hundreds of years, played in royal courts, at ceremonies, and at communal gatherings across a wide geographic area. Its tuning system and playing technique bear no resemblance to Western string instruments, having developed entirely independently. The player uses both hands in a style that more closely resembles keyboard playing than guitar or harp playing, thumbs handling a bass line while forefingers handle the melody, the two voices interlocking in patterns of extraordinary rhythmic complexity. The instrument that Westerners sometimes encounter at world music concerts and find unexpectedly moving is the product of a musical tradition as old and as sophisticated as anything Europe produced. It simply developed on different soil, in service of different purposes, with no reference to anything Western music did. The connection between music and mathematics has been known since antiquity, but the depth of that connection, revealed by modern physics, goes further than even Pythagoras imagined. Sound is vibration, the physical compression and rarefaction of air molecules at specific frequencies. A musical note at 440 Hz is air moving back and forth 440 times per second. An octave above it, at 880 Hz, is the same pattern of motion at exactly double the speed. The simplicity of this ratio, 2:1, is what makes the two notes sound related. The harmony emerges from the mathematics. It is not a cultural convention. It is a physical fact. When two notes are played together, their frequencies interact. Where the interactions produce simple ratios 2 to 1, 3 to 2, 4 to 3, the result is perceived as consonant, harmonious, stable, pleasing. Where the interactions produce complex, irregular ratios, the result is dissonant, tense, unstable, demanding movement. This is why the experience of musical tension and resolution, the feeling of being pulled towards something and then arriving, corresponds to an actual physical phenomenon. The tension is not imaginary. The resolution is not metaphorical. Something in the physics of sound waves changes when a dissonance resolves to a consonance, and the human ear and brain, tuned over millions of years to parse the acoustic environment, feel it directly. Music does not merely represent emotion. It creates conditions in the physical world, in the air, in the body, that produce emotional responses. The line between the sound and the feeling it causes is shorter, and more physical, than we usually think. Before the piano and the modern orchestral instruments defined what a standard ensemble sounded like, European courts of the Renaissance maintained musicians who played instruments that have since entirely disappeared from concert life. The viol family, bowed string instruments held between the legs, as a cello is held today, was the dominant chamber string instrument of the 16th and 17th centuries. Viols have frets, unlike modern string instruments. Their tone is softer, more reedy, more intimate than the violin family that replaced them. A consort of viols playing together produces a sound like a group of very quiet voices, each instrument with its own character, none dominant, all in a kind of conversation. They were replaced, gradually, by the violin family, louder, brighter, more projecting instruments better suited to the expanding concert halls and orchestras of the Baroque period. The last significant composer to write seriously for viols was Henry Purcell, at the very end of the 17th century. For roughly 200 years, the viol was simply gone. Not forgotten, the music remained, but unplayed, the instruments sitting in collections and museums, no tradition of playing them surviving in living practice. Their revival began in the early 20th century, when a handful of musicians decided to learn how to play them from scratch, reconstruct the bow technique from historical illustrations, and retune their ears to a sound that no living person had heard in regular use for 2 centuries. Today there are professional viol consorts performing again. The sound that was silent for 200 years is audible again. Music, of all the arts, is the one that most completely disappears when no one performs it. And the one most completely restored when someone does. The first music video, or something that can reasonably be called the precursor to the form, predates MTV by almost half a century. In the 1940s, a coin-operated device called the Panoram stood in bars, restaurants, and diners across the United States. It was a kind of visual jukebox. Customers inserted a coin, and a short-filmed musical performance played on a small screen, a singer with a band, a jazz number, a big band arrangement. These short films were called soundies. Soundies were produced in large numbers between 1940 and 1947, and they featured an extraordinary range of performers: Louis Jordan, Cab Calloway, Nat King Cole, Dorothy Dandridge, and many others. For many African American performers, soundies were one of the few available film media that did not require them to play degrading stereotyped roles, they could simply perform. The panoram was superseded by television, and soundies were largely forgotten. When MTV launched in 1981 and began commissioning filmed music performances to accompany records, it was widely described as an invention. It was, in a sense. But the impulse, to see the music as well as hear it, to give the sound a face and a body, had been there in the coin-operated machines of American diners 40 years earlier. The piano's middle C, the note at the physical and conceptual center of the keyboard, used as the universal point of reference for pitch across Western music, is not actually in the middle of the piano. On a standard 88-key piano, middle C is the 24th white key from the left. The physical middle of the keyboard is closer to E above middle C. Middle C is called middle because it is in the middle of the musical staff, exactly between the treble and bass clef staves, and because it sits approximately in the middle of the human vocal range. It is a conceptual center, not a spatial one. This small discrepancy is a good illustration of something that runs through all of music theory. The system is not a description of physical reality but a map drawn for human convenience. The equal-tempered scale is not acoustically pure. The treble and bass clef do not correspond to actual regions of physical space. The divisions of the octave into 12 equal semitones are not present in nature. They are agreements, conventions developed over centuries, for specific practical purposes, and then taught as if they were given. Every musician who has ever sat down at a piano and tried to understand what they were looking at was navigating, without knowing it, a system built from centuries of human decision-making, compromise, and convention, all of it designed to make a complex physical phenomenon tractable for human hands and human minds. The map is very good. It just is not the territory. Tuvan throat singing, a form of vocal technique practiced by the peoples of the Tuva region of Siberia and neighboring parts of Mongolia and China, allows a single human voice to produce multiple simultaneous pitches. This is not an illusion or a recording effect. A trained Tuvan singer produces a fundamental drone and then, through the precise shaping of the oral and nasal cavities, amplifies specific overtones of that fundamental frequency, separate harmonic frequencies that are present in any vocal sound but normally inaudible, to the point where they become clearly audible melodic tones. The result is one voice singing what sounds like two or three independent parts at the same time. Western musicology encountered throat singing relatively late. Documentation of the practice in European sources dates to 19th century travelers and ethnographers who struggled to describe what they were hearing in terms their readership would understand. Some assumed it was a trick or an illusion. Others recognized it immediately as something that the European vocal tradition had never imagined. The practice is ancient within its own tradition, connected to animistic spiritual beliefs about the sounds present in nature, in wind, in running water, in the voices of animals. The singer is not displaying technique. They are participating in the acoustic life of the world, making audible the harmonics that are always present but that untrained ears pass over. The fact that a single human throat can do this, that the human voice is physically capable of producing harmonic complexity that Western music never discovered because it never looked for it, is one of the more quietly astonishing facts about the instrument that every human being is born holding. The first music streaming service, or the concept that most directly anticipates it, was invented in 1897 in Belgium by a man named Clement Ader. He called it the theatrophone. The system used telephone lines to transmit live opera and theater performances from the Paris Opera and the Comédie Française to subscribers, who could hear the performance in real time through a telephone receiver. Subscribers paid a fee, lifted the receiver, and listened to whatever was being performed at that moment in the opera house. They could not choose what to hear. They could only listen to what was being broadcast. Similar systems were established in other cities. London's Electrophone service, operating from 1895 to 1925, connected subscribers to live West End performances. At its peak, it had roughly 600 subscribers. The theatrophone and its equivalents anticipated streaming with remarkable precision, music transmitted in real time over a telecommunications infrastructure, received in private homes, on a subscription basis. The core model was complete. What it lacked was any mechanism for choice, for the listener to determine what they heard, and any means of recording or storing the transmission. A subscriber to the Paris Theatrophone in 1900 and a subscriber to a modern streaming service in the present day are doing something with the same fundamental logic, paying for access to a continuous flow of music delivered to wherever they happen to be. The century and a quarter between them contains nothing but refinements to the original idea. Mozart, the composer whose name has become virtually synonymous with musical genius, began composing at age 5 and performing for European royalty at age 6. What is less commonly noted is that his early compositions, while technically precocious, are largely derivative, competent arrangements and elaborations of music he had already heard, demonstrating exceptional memory and facility rather than originality. The works that would secure his place in history came later, in adulthood, and at considerable personal cost. Mozart died at 35, in poverty, in circumstances that have been discussed and disputed for over 2 centuries. He was buried in an unmarked common grave, not, as Romantic legend later suggested, because he was neglected or persecuted, but because this was standard burial practice for most people in Vienna at the time, regardless of their status. The elaborate individual tunes of the famous were for a later era. The requiem he left unfinished at his death was completed by his student Franz Xaver Sussmayer, and the version performed today is largely Sussmayer's elaboration of Mozart's sketches. The ending of the Lacrimosa, one of the most moving passages in the entire work, was composed not by Mozart but by a 22-year-old student trying to honor what his teacher had begun. The requiem that people weep at, that concludes concerts dedicated to Mozart's memory, is a collaboration across death, half of it composed by a man who did not live to hear it performed, the other half by a young man trying to do justice to what had been left behind. The acoustic properties of ancient amphitheaters, structures built 2,500 years ago, are so sophisticated that modern acoustic engineers have spent decades trying to understand how they were achieved. The theater of Epidaurus in Greece, built in the 4th century BCE and capable of seating roughly 14,000 spectators, is the most studied. Sounds made at the center of its orchestra floor can be heard clearly from every seat, including the uppermost rows nearly 60 meters away. The signal-to-noise ratio, the clarity of the sound relative to ambient background noise, is remarkable by any standard. For a long time, this was attributed to the ideal geometry of the space, the circular orchestra, the curved seating banks, the hillside into which the theater was cut. And the geometry does contribute. But researchers studying the theater using modern acoustic measurement tools discovered something additional in the 1990s. The limestone seating material of the theater acts as a high-pass acoustic filter, selectively dampening low-frequency background noise, the wind, the crowd murmur, the random sonic environment, while passing the higher frequencies of the human voice. The builders of Epidaurus may not have understood this in acoustic engineering terms. But they built it. Whether by experience, by intuition, by a tradition of trial and observation that accumulated over generations, they built a space where a human voice could reach 14,000 ears with perfect clarity. The technique was lost. The theater endured. And 2,500 years later, plays are still performed there, and the voice still carries to the last row. The rhythm of the human heartbeat, approximately 60 to 100 beats per minute at rest, is very close to the tempo of a walking pace, and both are very close to the tempo at which most popular music is written. This is not a coincidence. It is, at minimum, a convergence. Research in music psychology has consistently found that humans are most easily entrained, most readily moved to synchronize their body movements with external rhythm at tempos in the range of 60 to 120 beats per minute. The tempo at which the foot naturally taps, the head naturally nods, the body naturally sways, coincides almost exactly with the range of a healthy resting heart rate. Music in the range of 60 beats per minute tends to be experienced as calm, settling, and conducive to rest. Music in the range of 120 to 140 beats per minute tends to be experienced as exciting and activating. This is why pop music, dance music, and exercise music cluster at the higher end of this range, and why music composed for sleeping, meditation, and relaxation clusters at the lower end. The human body carries its own metronome. The heart has been keeping time since before birth. Every piece of music a human being has ever found moving was working in some relationship with that rhythm, either matching it and calming the system, or lifting above it and pulling the body upward towards something it cannot quite reach. The Aboriginal Australian tradition of music and song contains what may be the oldest continuous musical culture on Earth. Songlines, the complex network of song paths that map the entire Australian continent, encode geographical knowledge, spiritual law, ancestral history, and navigational information in a system that has been maintained through oral transmission for at least 50,000 years and possibly significantly longer. A songline is a route across the landscape that follows the path of an ancestral being who, in the time of creation, sang the world into existence, named each feature of the land as they traveled, and in naming it, brought it into being. To sing a particular songline is to retrace the journey of that ancestor, to maintain the creation, to keep the world in its proper order. The songs are not metaphors. They are maps. Researchers have documented cases in which Aboriginal Australians navigated accurately across hundreds of kilometers of unfamiliar terrain using only the songs, identifying landmarks described in the lyrics of songs learned in childhood, in a landscape they had never physically visited. The implications of this for understanding what music is and what it can do are significant. In the Western tradition, music is primarily understood as emotional, as an art form concerned with feeling, with beauty, with the inner life. The songlines suggest a different and older function: music as a total cognitive system, a means of storing and transmitting information about the world, a way of knowing the land by singing it. The famous four-note motif that opens Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, short, long, the pattern usually written as 3Gs and an E-flat, has been described, analyzed, and interpreted so many times that the descriptions have largely replaced the experience of hearing it. It was famously described during World War II as the Morse code signal for the letter V... and broadcast by the BBC as a symbol of Allied resistance. This retroactive symbolism is so compelling and so frequently repeated that many listeners now hear the symphony primarily through it. What Beethoven himself said about the motif, according to his secretary Anton Schindler, was, "Thus fate knocks at the door." The problem with this account is that Schindler's reliability as a source has been repeatedly questioned by historians, and the famous remark may well be apocryphal. What the motif actually does, in the symphony itself, before any interpretation is applied to it, is announce a rhythmic identity with a confidence that the rest of the symphony spends its length testing, breaking, and ultimately confirming. The entire symphony is a working through of what that four-note pattern can mean, what it can become, where it can lead and where it cannot go. It is a question asked in 4 notes, answered in 40 minutes. The answer, when it comes at the end of the final movement, is not the same 4 notes. But it could not have been reached without them. Karaoke was invented in Japan in the early 1970s, by a musician named Daisuke Inoue. Inoue played in a band that provided musical accompaniment for businessmen who wanted to sing at bars and clubs. When asked to travel to Kobe with a client who wanted to sing during a trip but needed accompaniment, Inoue was unable to go. Instead, he built a machine that could play pre-recorded accompaniment tracks, so the client could sing along without needing a live band. He manufactured the machines and leased them to bars. The concept spread with extraordinary speed through Japan and then across Asia and eventually the world. Inoue did not patent his invention. He later said he did not realize it was the kind of thing you could patent. By the time karaoke had become a global phenomenon, worth billions of dollars annually, he had earned almost nothing from it directly. He worked for years selling cockroach extermination chemicals. He was eventually recognized by Time magazine in 1999 as one of the most influential people of the 20th century. What Inoue created was not just an entertainment technology. He created a context in which ordinary people with no training, no talent, no professional aspiration, could stand in front of others and make music. Could be, for 3 minutes and 30 seconds, the person holding the microphone. The desire that karaoke answers is the same desire that is present at every drum circle, every campfire sing-along, every church choir, every group of people who have ever leaned together over a table and started to sing. The desire not to listen to music, but to be inside it. The phenomenon of musical chills, the goosebumps, the shiver down the spine, the catch in the throat that a particular piece of music can cause is one of the most studied responses in the psychology of music. Researchers call it frisson, from the French word for shiver. Not everyone experiences it. Studies suggest that roughly 2/3 of the population report experiencing musical frisson at some point, with significant variation in how frequently and intensely it occurs. The remaining third may simply not be wired for it, for reasons that are not fully understood. When frisson occurs, it is measurable. Heart rate changes. Skin conductance changes. The muscles that control goosebumps activate a response controlled by the same neural pathway that produces goosebumps from cold or from fear. The brain releases dopamine, the same neurotransmitter involved in pleasure from food, from sex, from the anticipation of reward. What typically triggers frisson is not simply beautiful music. It is unexpected beauty, a sudden harmonic resolution in an unexpected direction, a voice entry that comes earlier or later or at a higher pitch than expected, a moment when the music does something the listening brain was not prepared for. The surprise is part of the mechanism. The brain, having predicted one thing and received something better, responds with a physical reaction that bypasses conscious assessment. It is, in a sense, the nervous system's acknowledgement that something happened that it did not see coming. A small shock of recognition that the world just did something more interesting than expected. The folk revival of the 1960s, the American and British movement that brought traditional and protest songs to mainstream audiences through figures like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and Pete Seeger, was, in part, a recovery operation. The songs being revived were, in many cases, genuine artifacts of earlier American working life: mining songs, railroad songs, sea shanties, Appalachian ballads, the music of labor camps and logging crews. They had been recorded and preserved primarily through the fieldwork of collectors like John Lomax and his son Alan, who traveled through the rural South, the prison farms, and the labor camps of America in the 1930s and 1940s with portable recording equipment, documenting music that was already disappearing. Lead Belly, born Huddai Ledbetter, discovered by the Lomaxes in a Louisiana prison in 1933, became one of the most important links between the living tradition of African American folk song and the white college students of the 1960s who would use his recordings as their musical education. Goodnight, Irene, the song most associated with Lead Belly, which became a #1 hit for the Weavers in 1950, had been learned by Lead Belly from his uncle, who had in turn learned it from sources lost to history. A song that traveled from unknown hands through a Louisiana prison, through a field recording to a college radio station to the folk cafes of Greenwich Village, and from there into the repertoire of a generation. Most of the important journeys in music history are journeys of exactly this kind. Unlikely. Indirect. Dependent on someone, somewhere, deciding that a sound was worth preserving. The gong, a percussion instrument found across East and Southeast Asia, produced by casting a disc of bronze alloy and suspending it for striking, is one of the oldest continuously used metal instruments in human history. Evidence of gong manufacture in China dates to approximately 500 BCE. Similar instruments appear in ancient Cambodia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and across the archipelagos of Southeast Asia, where the gamelan orchestra, a percussion ensemble built primarily around gongs and metallophones, represents one of the world's most sophisticated and ancient ensemble traditions. The gamelan of Bali and Java is not an ensemble in the Western sense. The musicians do not read from scores. The compositions are transmitted orally, from senior musician to student, through years of immersive learning. The music is cyclical rather than linear, built around repeating patterns of interlocking rhythms, each instrument occupying its particular layer in a texture of extraordinary complexity. When the composer Claude Debussy heard a Javanese gamelan at the 1889 Paris World Exhibition, he wrote about it with something approaching astonishment. What he described was a music that seemed to operate according to principles entirely different from everything he had been trained to expect: a different relationship between time, between melody, between the individual instrument and the collective sound. He said afterward that the gamelan had no counterpart in Western music, and that Western music should be embarrassed. His own subsequent music, his harmonic language, his approach to timbre, his rejection of developmental form was permanently changed by an afternoon in Paris listening to musicians from an island he had never visited and would never visit. The sound of church bells, the ringing that has marked time and summoned communities for over 1,000 years in Christian Europe, has its own science, its own engineering tradition, and its own profound acoustic mystery. A church bell does not produce a single pitch. It produces a complex of frequencies, the fundamental, and a set of overtones that in a well-cast bell form specific harmonic relationships. The art of bell founding, the craft of casting bronze bells, is in part the art of achieving the correct relationships between these overtones, so that the bell's composite sound is perceived as a single note with a characteristic resonance and decay. A badly cast bell is not simply out of tune. Its overtones clash with each other and with its fundamental, producing a dissonant, troubled sound that is immediately unsatisfying in ways that are difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. The great bell founders of Europe, the families and workshops that developed the craft from the medieval period onward, were engineers of acoustic harmony, working in bronze. The largest bell in the world is the Tsar bell in Moscow, cast in 1735. It weighs approximately 200 tons and has never been rung. A portion of the bell broke off during a fire before it could be mounted. It sits in the Kremlin, silent, the largest and most profoundly unheard bell ever made. The sound it would have produced has never been heard by human ears, and never will be. Music therapy, the clinical use of music by trained therapists to achieve specific health outcomes, is among the oldest documented medical practices in the Western tradition. Ancient Greek physicians used music in medical contexts. Hippocrates, the figure whose name is attached to the foundational oath of Western medicine, reportedly played music for the mentally ill. Plato described music as a cure for certain diseases of the soul. The practice appears in Egyptian medical papyri and in the writings of Arab physicians of the medieval period. What modern clinical research has added to this ancient intuition is evidence. Music therapy has now been studied extensively in contexts including pain management, neurological rehabilitation, mental health treatment, and palliative care. The results are not uniform. Music is not medicine in the sense of having a standardized dose and a predictable outcome, but they are significant enough to have established music therapy as a recognized clinical specialty in most Western countries. Pain patients who listen to music during procedures require less sedation. Stroke patients who undergo rhythmic auditory stimulation, walking or performing motor tasks to a steady beat, show significantly improved gait recovery. Premature infants exposed to live music in the NICU show improved developmental outcomes. The mechanism is not fully understood. What is clear is that music does something in the body and brain that other stimuli do not: activate systems, releases substances, creates states, that has genuine clinical effects. The ancient physicians who played music for the sick were working with an incomplete understanding. They were not wrong. The word song has a continuous linguistic history in the English language stretching back over 1,000 years to the Old English sang, meaning the act of singing or the sound produced by singing. The same Germanic root, from Proto-Germanic * sangwas, gives English sing, and is cognate with German singen and Dutch zingen. The root is believed to derive from a Proto-Indo-European root meaning something like to make sounds with the mouth or to speak in a sustained melodic manner. Languages tend to preserve their oldest words, the ones attached to the most fundamental human activities. The words for mother, father, water, fire, hand, and eye are among the most stable in the languages that share Indo-European roots, because they name things that have been present throughout the entire history of the people who spoke those languages. The word for song is in that category. Older than any written record of English. Older than the oldest surviving literature in any Germanic language. Present in the mouths of people who crossed into the British Isles over 1,000 years ago, and present in the mouths of people living there today. Language does not preserve what is peripheral. It preserves what is necessary. The fact that the word for the act of singing is one of the oldest English words in continuous use is, in its quiet way, evidence. of how long humans have been making music, of how central it has been to what it means to live a human life. The relationship between music and language in the human brain is one of the most studied areas in cognitive neuroscience, and it continues to surprise researchers. The question that organizes much of this research is whether music and language use the same cognitive systems or different ones. The early assumption was that they were entirely separate, language in the left hemisphere, music distributed across both. Decades of brain imaging research have complicated this picture significantly. It now appears that music and language share certain processing resources, particularly in the areas of syntax, the rules governing how elements combine into sequences. The brain applies similar structural principles to parsing a musical phrase and parsing a sentence. The expectation of a harmonic resolution and the expectation of a grammatical completion activate overlapping neural networks. What is even more striking is that musical training changes the brain in ways that directly improve language processing. Children who receive music instruction show enhanced phonological awareness, the ability to distinguish sounds in spoken language, and this advantage translates to reading and literacy development. The brain strengthened by music is better at language. This connection runs in the other direction too. Patients with certain types of aphasia, language impairments caused by brain injury, can sometimes still sing words they can no longer speak. The melody provides a route around the damage. There are cases of people who cannot say their own name being able to sing it. The two arts grew from the same root. At the neurological level, the separation between them is never quite complete. The hurdy-gurdy, a stringed instrument whose strings are vibrated by a rosin wheel turned by a hand crank, rather than by a bow, has one of the strangest and most improbable histories of any instrument in the Western tradition. It first appears in the historical record in the late 10th century, when it is described as an organist drum, a large instrument requiring two players, one to turn the crank and one to adjust the pitch. It was used primarily in religious settings, to help choirs stay on pitch. Over the following centuries it was miniaturized, modified, and eventually transformed into a street instrument, a device associated with wandering musicians, beggars, and itinerant performers. It lost its respectability as the upper classes abandoned it for the lute and the violin. By the 17th century, the hurdy-gurdy was essentially a street musician's instrument, considered too coarse and rustic for serious attention. Then, in the 18th century, the French aristocracy rediscovered it. Marie Antoinette played the hurdy-gurdy. Haydn and Mozart wrote music for it. For a brief period, it became fashionable at the highest social levels in France. Then the revolution arrived, and the hurdy-gurdy's royal associations became, briefly, dangerous. It retreated again, back to the folk tradition, where it remained for most of the following 2 centuries. Today it is played in folk music revivals across Europe, and has been adopted by musicians working in experimental and early music contexts. It has been aristocratic, plebeian, sacred, profane, fashionable, obsolete, and revived, in roughly that order. Few instruments have traveled through so many social worlds in 1,000 years. The development of recorded music fundamentally changed how composers wrote music, and not in the ways usually assumed. The most often noted effect is expansion. Recording allowed composers to reach audiences they could never have reached in live performance, and to have their works preserved exactly as they intended. Both of these are true. But there was a subtler effect that ran in the opposite direction. Live performance is always uncertain. The concert hall has a particular acoustic. The orchestra has a particular sound on a particular night. The performance changes from evening to evening in ways neither the composer nor the performers can fully control. This variability was not always experienced as a problem, it was understood as part of what music was. The work was not the score. The work was the event. Recording changed this. A recorded performance became fixed, a definitive artifact, the same on every playing, in every room, forever. Composers and performers became acutely conscious that what they committed to tape would be heard, compared, and judged not against the memory of other live performances but against the recorded performances of everyone who had ever recorded the same piece. Some composers embraced the studio as a compositional environment. The Beatles, from Sgt. Pepper's onward, made music that was designed specifically for the recorded medium, that exploited the studio's capacity for layering, editing, and sound manipulation, and that was never intended to be replicated live. Their recordings are not documents of performances. They are the performances. The original and the copy became the same thing. The world's largest musical instrument is an organ. The Boardwalk Hall Auditorium organ in Atlantic City, New Jersey, was completed in 1932 and remains the largest pipe organ ever built by any measure. It has 33,112 pipes, ranging in size from the length of a pencil to 64 feet. Its largest pipes produce tones so low that they are felt by the body rather than heard by the ear, frequencies below the threshold of human hearing, but still capable of producing physical sensation. The instrument was designed to fill the Boardwalk Hall Auditorium, which had been built to host the Democratic National Convention and had acoustic properties, a ceiling 137 feet high, seating for 41,000 people, that made it one of the most acoustically challenging spaces in the world. A normal orchestra was simply swallowed by the room. The organ was designed to be big enough that the room could not swallow it. It fell into serious disrepair in the second half of the 20th century. Multiple pipes were damaged or destroyed. Entire sections became unplayable. A decades-long restoration effort has gradually brought significant portions of the instrument back to working condition, though the full restoration remains incomplete. The organ at Boardwalk Hall is, by any reasonable assessment, too large. It is an instrument built in response to an architectural challenge that was itself a kind of excess, producing a solution that goes beyond any musical necessity. It is, in its way, a monument to the human tendency to answer the question, how much is enough, with more. The phenomenon of musical earworms, involuntary, intrusive musical imagery, the experience of a melody repeating in the mind without any intention or desire, is one of the most universal in human experience. Studies estimate that roughly 98% of people experience earworms regularly. The term itself, Ohrwurm in German, meaning literally earworm, has been in use since at least the early 20th century. The experience is so common and so consistently described that it has the character of a species-wide trait rather than an individual quirk. Research into earworms has found some consistent features. They tend to be melodies rather than lyrics alone. They tend to be relatively simple, with short, memorable phrases that loop naturally. They tend to begin after exposure to the tune, but can also be triggered by emotional states, physical experiences, or seemingly unrelated associations. Once started, they can be extremely difficult to stop. Attempts to suppress an earworm often intensify it, through the well-documented ironic process by which deliberate attempts at thought suppression increase the thought's accessibility. What earworms suggest about the relationship between music and consciousness is something researchers are still working to understand. The auditory cortex, in the absence of actual sound, can produce detailed internal representations of music, precise enough to reproduce tempo, timbre, and harmonic structure, not merely the general shape of a melody. The brain, apparently, does not stop doing music simply because the music has stopped. It continues. It carries the sound forward into silence and plays it there, unbidden, in the theater of the inner ear. The music of the 20th century's avant-garde, the compositions of Schoenberg, Webern, Cage, Stockhausen, and their followers, was, for much of its history, genuinely unpopular with general audiences. This was not always the case for new music. For most of the history of Western art music, the newest music was also, broadly speaking, the most popular. Concert audiences in the 18th and 19th centuries came to hear new works. Beethoven's symphonies were first performed to audiences for whom they were contemporary music. So were Mozart's operas, Brahms's concertos, Verdi's arias. The split between the music that specialists and critics considered most advanced and the music that general audiences found moving and wanted to hear again widened through the 20th century to a degree unprecedented in Western musical history. By the 1950s and 1960s, much of the music being composed under the banner of the avant-garde was received with active hostility by audiences, not indifference, but hostility, and the composers and theorists associated with it largely responded by arguing that the audience was wrong. The argument had a certain internal logic: if difficulty was evidence of seriousness, then pleasure was evidence of compromise. Music that gave too much too easily was, by this reasoning, music that had not demanded enough of itself. What happened instead was that popular music, jazz, blues, rock and roll, soul, continued to evolve in ways that were formally sophisticated and emotionally immediate simultaneously. The avant-garde held its position. The audience simply went elsewhere. The last fact is not about any single piece of music, any instrument, or any composer. It is about what happens when music ends. In a concert hall, at the end of a performance, there is a moment, sometimes less than a second, sometimes considerably longer, between the last sound and the first applause. Musicians who have played in great ensembles, and audiences who have heard great performances, often identify this moment as among the most intense of the entire event. The music is over. The silence is loaded with what has just been heard. Nothing has yet been said. Composers have written about this silence. Conductors have described learning to wait for it to stand still, baton lowered, through the charged air of the resonance, allowing the silence to be itself before the applause begins and the ordinary world reasserts itself. What is happening in this moment is difficult to name. The sound is gone. But something continues in the ears that are still vibrating, in the bodies that are still altered by what they experienced, in the minds that are still holding the last chord or the last phrase or the last note as it fades into the acoustic of the room. It is the same silence that preceded the first deliberate sound ever made by a human being, in a cave whose location we will never know, by a person whose name we will never have. And in that silence, if you are quiet enough, you can still hear it, the moment just before, when there was no music yet, and the world was waiting. There is a frequency, researchers have found, at which the human infant begins to respond to music before birth, while still surrounded by the muffled underwater world of the womb, registering rhythm and pitch through the wall of flesh and fluid and bone that separates it from the sounding world. Before the first breath. Before the first word. Before consciousness assembles itself into anything we would recognize as a self. The music is already there. What we have traveled through tonight is the long, improbable story of how that response was developed, formalized, transmitted, argued over, celebrated, suppressed, revived, and carried forward across a span of time so vast that the entire history of human civilization occupies only the last fraction of it. From a griffin vulture's wing bone in a German cave to a streaming service on a device in your hand. From an anonymous throat in the deep past, lifting a sustained note into darkness, to every symphony and blues song and lullaby and folk ballad and electronic composition that followed. The most extraordinary thing about this journey is not how far music has traveled. It is how little, in certain fundamental ways, it has changed. The infant born tonight will be calmed by the same rhythmic patterns that calmed infants 50,000 years ago. The chord that produces frisson in a modern listener is governed by the same acoustic mathematics that governed every musical response in human history. The grief in a blues song and the grief in a Mesopotamian lament share a human root that predates both of them. Music is not a product of civilization. It is what civilization grew around, the practice that was already in place before cities, before writing, before the division of labor that allowed some people to spend their time building things and others to spend their time thinking about what to build. It was there at the beginning of the human world, in the dark and the firelight, keeping time with something older than time. The most ordinary sounds now carry this weight. A melody from a passing car. A song remembered from childhood. A note held just a little longer than expected, in a room full of people who are, for that moment, the same. Every sound made in the long history of human music was made by someone who, in some sense, was you, who breathed the same air, felt the same grief and the same joy, and needed, more than they could say, to make that felt. You have been carrying this forward all your life without knowing it. That is what music is for. Sleep well.